say I had always been on some sort of a spiritual journey. But I think we all are, because we're actually spirit. We're spirits that are believing we're housed in these meat puppets, right? But so our whole life is our spiritual life. There's actually no separation, but we're not taught that as kids. So I just started to realize, like, oh, and that's when I started to take my spiritual journey more seriously. And then that's when I started to put some tools in my tool belt about how to navigate stuff. So I basically went from, here's what I say. I suffered enough that I say there were times when I just wanted to unzip myself and crawl out of myself. I was so sick of my own shit. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so I'm going to finally stop talking. But it was basically like, it had to get so bad that I either, like, my spiritual team sent me some divine gifts to help me, but I had to be willing to pay attention enough to see them and to pick up the tools that they were laying at my feet and to put them to work. Because it doesn't matter if you read all the books or go to all the seminars and get all the therapy. If you don't practically apply it and live it, what's the point?
Yeah, there's something that you said, a couple things that are, I think, are really key. And I just want to pull out that, you know, you had the moment in the church.
Yes.
And, you know, growing up Catholic, I know that moment. But you handled it in a way that is really unique. You did not turn away. You said, okay, I need to have a direct relationship. And so you listened, you were connected, you know, you listened. And then again, when you're in this, you know, bookstore, and, you know, if anybody has been in a place where they don't have a lot of money, and there's a lot that can be in your head that you pay attention to more than a voice that is taking you to an idol. And so for you to go, okay, and then act on it. So it's that kind of a level of willingness, I think, is also an evident. You really are willing. It's not like you're like, no, I got it, read the book, I'm good. But you just seem incredibly willing to move towards health and spirit.
Yeah, that is so, I love that you're saying that. And I recognize I'm being rude and interrupted you a little bit, but I just got so excited because what A Course in Miracles says is that all that Spirit or Holy Spirit needs is a tiny bit of willingness. I wasn't, like you're saying, and I appreciate that, like, oh, you were so willing. I don't know if I was so willing, but I had a tiny bit of willingness. I had just enough that I was willing, like there's a part of my brain that knew, and I think some of us all know this, we might not want to admit it, but there's some part of your brain that is constantly saying, there's got to be a better way. It shouldn't be this fucking hard. Like, it just shouldn't be this hard. And when you start to have that tiny bit of willingness, the willingness is all. That's what I say to people. The willingness is all. You don't have to have the how. You don't have to have all the answers. It's like when people are transitioning from being meat eaters to vegetarian or vegan, you just have to have a tiny bit of willingness to look at things differently. And that's all that I was. But I often say now, like, I have this new saying that I love where I say, and I'm not sure, I wish I knew it, like, you know, one of those things where you're like, I either heard it or I felt it, but there's this saying and I don't know who to give credit to. So if it's somebody else and somebody knows, let me know. But it feels really personal to me, which is tiny hinges open really big doors. And that's all that a little bit of willingness was, is it opened up a whole new world of possibility to me that, like, who knew that I could live and not suffer? Like, I'm an annoyingly happy person. You know, A Course in Miracles says, peace and happiness are your natural inheritance. So for me, if people aren't feeling generally peaceful and happy, then there's a problem. They've taken a lot of detours into fear. And they didn't just take a detour, they got off the highway and they bought real estate, right? And I'm like, don't pitch a tent. Don't buy it. Don't buy the condo. Like, just get back on the highway, right? And I think you have to be willing to let go of your stories. And that's so much of the work that I do. Like, my programs are called like Fearless Flow Mentoring and transforming your story to your glory. It's like that willingness to let go of seeing yourself as victimized, as small, as separate, in scarcity, in sickness, right? And I was just like, that's not me. And I think that, you know, we'll say things to people like, oh, but they're so brave. or they're so special. I couldn't have done that. And I just don't buy it. I think we all come through what I call hardiness, a hardiness to us. And whether you call that grit or resilience or toughness or strength, I think we all get it. But it's hard for us sometimes to envision ourselves this way. I got lucky that I had enough tough shit happen to me, and I was raised by somebody. And look, when I go back and look at my childhood, and it can seem sometimes like I'm being hard on my dad. Like, I'm like, yeah, my dad allowed no weakness. He poked us, he pushed us, he did those things. Yeah, he was not, would I have changed that? Like, one part of my brain goes, it would have been nice not to be terrified my whole childhood. But the other part of me says, oh, he was actually providing me. I said he was an unintentional teacher. He was providing me with what I was going to need because life was about to get really tough.
Right.
And I had that hardiness. And yeah, so anyways, I think the willingness piece is so important. And I'm so happy you're wicked smart, because I say a lot of things and I won't remember what I said, and you just extracted that out, and I was like, yes to willingness. So thank you for that.
It is, and especially in moments of pain like that, and coming from, I kind of like imagine your upbringing is that kind of mafia values, you know, where
Oh, you could not have, like, yes, my Uncle Manny, right? So I'm an Irish kid, but my step family was Italian and Portuguese.
oh,
So it was like the Corleones. It was like living with the mafia people. Exactly.
it does, yeah, it goes right to, I'm going to break your legs, you know, like.
Exactly, yes.
Break your legs. So, and to find that, you know, that willing to even be willing, I love. And so you have this kid growing up, and you have a moment, you're paying attention, and then I'm assuming at this point you're still, you know, eating meat and dairy, or maybe being a vegan. So what happened, you know, and I can sometimes liken it to coming out of the matrix. Like, for some people have that kind of awakening, some people it's a little bit more of an educational variety, or piece by piece, and then the light bulb goes off at some point. So what was your kind of moment where you realized, I don't want to eat animals?
Yeah, all right. So I have two, possibly three, but two really big things that stood out. So Marianne Williamson, who's, you know, the great writer that I talk about, she's currently running for president of the United States. Marianne became my like my spiritual godmother and my mentor and my teacher, and I lived and worked with her in California. And she had set me up with this guy to date this guy, and he had also had a murder in his life. And so it was like this thing where she thought we would understand each other. And we dated for a while, and he was a musician, a professional musician. And so I went out on tour with him for like 2 weeks, okay? And so when I was out with him, I knew that he was vegan. I don't know if I fully understood completely what that meant, because this was like 20 years ago. This was like way back, right?
On the radar.
And he had been vegan at that point already for like, he had been doing it for a long time. So he was like a unicorn. Like, I was like, vegan, like what? And so, you know, up until that point, I had been pounding McDonald's still practically, you know? And so I was always like a gym rat. But like, I would come out of the gym and like light a cigarette. Or I'd come out of the gym and like go to McDonald's. Like, made no sense. So I looked fit, but I was putting shit in my body. But anyway, so when I was out on tour with him one time, I'll never forget this. We went to a restaurant, and I already had decided, I wasn't, out of respect for him, I was not going to eat meat, right? I wasn't going to like eat that on the tour or whatever. And he kept it really clean. Like, he brought his blender everywhere. He did green things, like whatever. And I was like, cool, whatever. And I was just open. I've always been curious. That's one of the other things, the willingness and curiosity. I was always wicked curious, like, why does man do what they do? Like, what's this about? So I remember when it came time to order, I said instead that I was going to get, instead of getting anything like that, I was just going to get some pizza. And I said to him, you know, would you ever eat pizza? I just knew he didn't eat animals. I didn't know about the dairy and the eggs yet, Pat, right? And he just looked at me with the most disgusted face. And he's like, why would I ever eat that? It's nothing but like, you know, he's like, it's suffering soaked in pus and blood, like cheese, right? And I'm like, what?
Right.
I literally didn't know what he meant.
Right.
And I was like, what? And I was like, what do you mean? And I was a city kid. This is going to sound so ignorant. But I was a city kid. I literally didn't know that dairy cows didn't just naturally produce milk.
Right.
I didn't know that they were like women, that they only lactated when they were impregnated. And I didn't understand the process of how dairy industry keeps them pregnant, and then the dairy industry is because of the, you know, the veal industry only exists because of the like I had no idea. And when he cracked that knowledge open in me in that moment, I was like, oh, I don't know shit. So I started to educate myself. That was number one. And then it occurred to me that I was a fucking hypocrite. That I'd been saying my whole life, and I still do believe this, animals are one of my fastest pathways to the divine. Animals have saved me, like have saved me time and time again. That unconditional love, that relationship that I have with them, it's very uncomplicated, it's very pure. And I realized that I had been walking around my whole life calling myself an animal lover while I was eating them, while I was participating in their suffering, their abuse, their rape, their slaughter. Like I didn't know. But I was the kind of person, because let's call a spade a spade. There are a lot of people out there that know, but they choose to be willfully ignorant. But I was the kind of kid, I was wicked sensitive. I think like all kids are. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. So then I stopped seeing like, oh, cheesy pizza, or oh, like, you know, like steak. I was like, oh, that's dead cow that suffered. And I realized that I had made a lot of choices for a long time without thinking of past the plate. It was, what's the consequence of this choice? And why am I doing this just for my taste buds? Like, really? I'm going to participate in the slaughter and suffering all these animals because it tastes good? So that was number two. So Bobby Rock was my first wake-up call. And to this day, I'm so grateful to him. We're still good friends. And I still say, like, you were the start of my vegan journey. Then I started to educate myself. And I watched all the terrible videos. And I watched all the movies and the clips. And I read the books. And I did my homework. And I was like, oh, my God. And I started to do that. So I started off, I was just vegetarian. First of all, I was pescatarian. I still ate fish because I was dating a guy that came from a fish. After Bobby, I started dating a guy that came from another musician. I've dated a ton of musicians, and I married a musician. But anyways, he came from like a fisherman's family. So I stopped eating, you know, quote unquote meat, but fish was still meat, but I was still educating myself. And then it became meat. And then I stopped eating eggs. The last thing I gave up was cheese, because dairy is, as we know, is so seductive. Like, dairy is one of the hardest things for people to quit, but I finally did it. But here's what happened. And at the same time, during all of this was going on, I started doing research for my memoir about my mother's murder. Because like I said, we weren't allowed to see anything when I was a kid. And I had just been like haunted by what happened that night. Like, I knew what happened, but as my writing mentor, Andre Dubus III always says, we know what happened, but what the hell happened? Right. And that's what I was trying to figure out. So I wrote back east. I got on the phone. I called the Lawrence Eagle Tribune. I asked if there was anybody there